Hi everyone, and welcome to week 5, where we'll be talking about critical writing and world Englishes. But before we move on to talking about those particular articles, I just wanted to briefly thank everybody for the great conversation this past week. And I was really encouraged to see how everybody was able to relate the different articles that you read to your own teaching situations. That was really good to see, and I learned a lot more about what you're doing and how relevant the articles are. And it was great to see that you could actually draw on some of the insights from the articles and frame it around your own teaching context. So that was really encouraging. I wanted to share a few books with you that I think I may have mentioned in some of the postings I did, but I have them here in my own library, so let me show them to you. Two books by Nancy Dean are on voice. And I think this was in response to Peter. They look like this. One is called Voice Lessons, and the other one, if I can do this right, I'm having difficulty. Oh, this way, sorry. Discovering Voice. And she does a pretty decent job, I have to say, teaching students about voice in a very specific, guided way. And these books are made for middle school, high school age adolescents. That's not to say that these activities couldn't be adapted for university students or even adults, or even for students who are much younger. I think certainly you can try different things based on your context and see how they work. But they're the only two workbooks or textbooks, if you will, that actually talk about voice with activities in any sort of constructed way. Most books, as you probably found out by now, don't really talk about voice very much, or if they do, it's just a little bit. And it goes to this whole notion of, how do we talk about it? What do we do with it? How do we teach it? Can it be taught? So apparently Nancy Dean says it can be. So take a look at that. There were some conversations around English imperialism, and there is a really interesting book by Robert Phillipson on linguistic imperialism, and he talks a lot about English. And his spouse or his longtime partner, Tove Skutnag-Kangas, who is, I believe she's in Copenhagen. I think they're both in Copenhagen. And she writes a lot about language policy. They're both writing actually about language policy and planning. And she has, writes a lot about English in terms of English is somewhat of a parasitic language where it kind of goes into communities and gobbles up other languages and forces speakers of those other languages, with little or no resources. And if they want access to those resources, they have to learn English. So if you're interested in language policy and planning, those two, Phillipson and Skutnag-Kangas, are two people I would recommend you take a look at. And there's been a lot of talk about Bourdieu, and this book came out a couple of years ago, I think. It's Pierre Bourdieu and Literacy Education, and it's edited by James Albright and Alan Luke, and it's very interesting because, in fact, there's Monica Heller, who is an OIC faculty member, has a chapter in here, and other people in our field like Claire Crump, who's at Berkeley, has a chapter in here as well. And if you're interested in Bourdieu and the notion of symbolic, linguistic, academic capital, this is certainly the book to see how all those concepts are applied in educational contexts. I also wanted to share one book that I really liked called Culturally Contested Literacies, America's Rainbow Underclass and Urban Schools. And it's by Guifang Li. It looks like this. So if you're interested in literacy education, sort of off the mainstream, and way in which educators get students who come from different literacy-based backgrounds, and the ways in which multiliteracies are used in various classrooms to engage readers in different ways, this may be a very interesting book for you, and it draws on various case studies from different contexts that I think you may find really enjoyable. So check those books out, and if you look at them, read them, let me know what you think. So I wanted to mention briefly about the assignment for this week, which was the textbook critique. And I hope everybody feels pretty good about that. And I only had a couple questions from folks this past week, but it seemed like everybody pretty much knew what to do. And I had the peer critique sheet that I posted, and I hope that was clear and gave you some guidelines. By no means, when you're giving feedback to your peers in your group, that you need to follow all of those steps. This is just sort of a general guideline to follow on things that you'd like to comment on, things that you may find relevant to bring to your peers' attention, so on and so forth. But it gives us sort of a nice step into providing feedback, because the next assignment after this will be actually practicing feedback, and this will be one way to kind of get our feet wet in that area. And that next assignment will be due in March, and I'll give you plenty of structure around that, and so you don't need to worry about that now. Anyway, so for this week, take those critiques and post them to one of those groups. I think there are 4 groups, and I was imagining maybe 3 or 4 people per group. And if one of those groups is filled up, you can find another group to put your paper in, submit your paper, and you can give feedback using a comment function or track changes, or however you want to approach giving feedback. And then that'll allow everybody at least a week, 5 days or so, to make any revisions that they feel are necessary, and then you can send it to me at the second language composing at Gmail, that address, and then I'll read it, give you feedback, and send it back, so it's all private. Next week, Thursday through Monday, I'm going to be in Washington, D.C. at a conference, at a sociolinguistic conference, so my email access might be a little bit shaky. So if you don't hear from me during that period of time, don't worry. Hopefully I'll have a podcast up and ready to go by next Monday when I get back to Toronto. If I can do it in Washington, that'd be great. And if I can do it with some spectacular background like the White House, probably not, but who knows? I'll try to do that. Last but not least would be the readings for this week, and I think you'll really, really like them. So they relate to a lot of the themes that we've been talking about. And there are 2 pieces that I chose. One is Bean et al. There are about 10 authors, and some you may recognize, such as Paul Matsuda and Peter Elbow, for example. And this is Should we invite students to write in home languages, complicating the yes and no debate. So thinking about, in our classrooms, students coming from various second dialect backgrounds and language backgrounds, to what degree should students be allowed in the process of using their first language in the composing process? So they ask some very good questions, and they make particular statements on what their beliefs are. The second article is maybe a little bit more radical, by Suresh Kanagaraja, and that's The Place of World Englishes in Composition, Pluralization Continued. And I took a course from him once at Penn State about 2 or 3 years ago, and it was all in World Englishes. And he talked a lot about how, in second language education, certainly students are allowed to explore and use the first languages in any part of the process, except for writing. Writing tends to be this still very prescriptive, almost sacrosanct area where native or first language voices are really what are foregrounded and preferred. So he problematizes a lot of those notions to think about, what are ways in which second language voices, if you will, can come into compositions and into writing. And he makes very good examples. For example, in the history of English, people have often, quite frequently, inserted French or Latin or German into their writing to give them a degree of prestige. And no one thought that to be problematic. But in certain cases where there are other languages that weren't seen as prestige languages, then it's become somewhat of a problem. So he looks at lots of these different issues, and he pulls some of his own research out, looks at what's happened. He also looks at other researchers and seeing in which they sort of played with the language and see what they come up and recommend. So I think you'll really like this, these 2 articles, and thinking about your own language learning context yourself, and your teaching context currently, and the writing that you're receiving from your students, and how you give feedback on it in your relation to how they may use their own first language in their second language writing. I wish you all a wonderful week, and I hope you enjoy the peer feedback process and the process of critiquing a textbook. I'm looking very much forward to seeing all of the books that everybody critiqued and your feelings about it. And so have a good week, enjoy the articles, and I'll see you online. Take care. Bye-bye.